really wish you could sleep, but for whatever reason, sleep is just escaping you. We've probably all been there. And there are those times, which maybe you can recall, where you know that you really, really don't want to fall asleep. Maybe it's most evident when you're driving your car real late at night, and you're having a really, really hard time staying awake. I don't know how late it was when the disciples and Jesus were out there in the Garden of Gethsemane. I think it might have been pretty late at night. We know that it was after everything that had happened there at the Last Supper, and if you read in the Gospels, there's whole chapters worth of teaching that Jesus gave his disciples that night. So by the time everything about the meal and the sacrament and Judas leaving and everything else had happened, and they made their way out to the Mount of Olives, it may have been pretty late. But I'm not trying to make excuses for the disciples, because clearly they should have known that this was no time for them to be falling asleep. This was no ordinary night. Jesus had told them that this was the time when his suffering was about to begin. He had told them there in the upper room, the hour has come, now the Son of Man is going to be glorified. And as he left them, first one group and then another group, Peter, James, and John of his disciples, he specifically told them, I want you to stay here and keep watch with me. This was both for his sake and for theirs. On the one hand, Jesus surely wanted the prayers of his friends, his disciples that he had been teaching and training and spending time with these last 3 years. He wanted their support as he went through these crucial hours right before the incredible suffering for the sins of the world was to begin. He wanted them to pray for him as well. But as always, Jesus is most of all thinking of them and of their souls. Their faith was going to be tested. Their faithfulness, their allegiance to Jesus was going to be sorely tested in just a matter of moments. So he wanted them to pray for the strength to be able to endure all that they were going to go through. But as we read a moment ago, alas, it was not to be. As Jesus went further into the garden to be by himself and spent those moments of anguished prayer, asking his Father that if it were possible, if there was any other way that this cup of suffering might be taken away, yet not my will but yours be done. When he came back to the disciples, they were sleeping. As always, when it comes to his work of saving sinners, Jesus was going to have to do that entirely alone. And unfortunately, their performance, the disciples, did not improve when they were given a second chance, because we're told that when Jesus came back the first time, he woke them up and said specifically to Peter, couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. But even having given that rebuke, when he prayed a second time and then came back, they were all sleeping again, and this time we're told they didn't even know what they should say to him at that point. The whole situation would be almost comical if the subject matter were not so serious. It would also maybe be a whole lot more comical if you and I were not guilty of doing the very same thing. And no, I'm not accusing you specifically of falling asleep in church. Not necessarily, anyway, unless you did. Right? But the problem that the disciples had is the same problem that you and I have, the same problem that the church of every age faces. The struggle to keep on watching and praying so that we don't fall into temptation. The struggle of having a willing spirit, but having to battle all the time against that weak, sinful flesh. The struggle of not realizing when it is that we are in spiritual danger. Let me go back to the example of driving a car again, because I think it really fits in a lot of ways pretty well with the situation spiritually that we face every day. So when are you in danger when you're driving your car? Or maybe to ask it a different way, when do you most realize that you're in danger when you're driving the car? And those two questions might not have the same answer. If it's dark out and you're driving in a thick snowstorm, which I hope not to do on the way home if the snow holds off a little longer. But if you're in that situation, are you tempted to be distracted? I'm guessing not, right? That's the time when you are really laser focused on the road and you got both hands on the wheel and you are paying really close attention. No, the danger might actually happen when the sun is shining and the road is pretty empty and you got a nice open road without a lot of traffic in front of you. That's the sort of time, right? Admit it, when you're a little bit tempted to start taking out your cell phone and scrolling through the headlines as you look back and forth. But the reality is, when are you in danger when you're driving? And of course, the answer is you really don't know where and when the danger lies, right? You don't know when the large furry animal is going to suddenly jump out in front of you on the road. You don't know when some other distracted driver is going to come drifting across the center line and become oncoming traffic or pull out in front of you at a blind corner or something like that. And when it comes to falling asleep at the wheel, well, it doesn't matter how many other cars or how many other people are involved. You can get into plenty of trouble all on your own if that's what's going on. Well, now, think of that and compare it again to our spiritual situation a little bit and ask yourself, when is there a good time to take your eyes off Jesus? And again, maybe to ask it another way, when are you most tempted to do that? And is the answer to that question necessarily at a time when there is a big and stressful crisis in your life? When you've got a critical surgery coming up on your calendar, or when it is a time of loss or grief or something like that, or when there's a big problem in a family relationship or a serious money problem or something like that. To be sure, there are temptations that go along with every one of those things, and the devil certainly tries to use them to tear you away from God. Maybe to try to convince you that God must not really love you that much, or he wouldn't allow you to go through all this in the first place. But honestly, aren't we more likely to be spiritually asleep at the wheel when things in our lives don't seem that difficult? When things seem like they're going pretty good and we're just distracted from Christ? When we're bored and have an open internet connection? Or when we're having a good time, maybe too good of a time, and we just get caught up in our earthly activities, and all of a sudden there's temptations of pride or greed or lust or arrogance or any number of other temptations just lurking there in the bushes, waiting to leap out and drag us off the path. Watch and pray, Jesus says, always. There's no good time to let yourself become distant from Jesus Christ. There's no good time to let your faith life slide and be forgotten, because we don't always know when and where the danger lies. And for that matter, we also don't know how much time we have left in this life in the first place. But Jesus was not deterred. In spite of how disappointed he must have felt in seeing his disciples that he had worked so hard to train and teach for these last years of his life, in spite of his disappointment in seeing how they didn't listen to him, how they hadn't prayed for him, Jesus simply goes back, prays that third time, receives strength from that angel that the Lord sent him in answer to prayer, and then he simply comes back and says, all right, guys, time's up. Let's go. Here comes my betrayer. As Judas is walking into the garden with the coins of his downfall still jingling in his pocket. Jesus didn't love his disciples any less for their failures. That's amazing. That's not just human love, that's nothing less than divine grace. And we know that those disciples, those sleeping ones, in the end did become bold and faithful witnesses of Jesus Christ in the years to come. But that's not to say that their spiritual carelessness here had no cost. The disciples did all abandon Jesus. Peter denied 3 times that he knew him. All of them ran away. All of them had to spend those next couple of days and hours in this hopeless confusion and despair when maybe they might have understood. If only they had prayed for wisdom. If only they had prayed that the Holy Spirit might help them to understand the meaning of all of these things that were happening, everything Jesus had said to them, they might have been able to spend those next days eagerly looking forward to the resurrection, because Jesus had told them about that often enough too. Instead, they had to spend those hours in hopelessness and despair. They all had, for the rest of their life, the shameful memory of the time when they ran away and left Jesus out of fear. And as long as we mention Judas, there's the ultimate example, right, of what spiritual carelessness can cost. Judas is still paying for that now, and he will forever. Jesus wanted to spare his disciples from all of that. He wants to spare you from all of the pain and harm that spiritual carelessness brings into your life. He died to spare you from the eternal consequences of those sins. But what Jesus doesn't want to spare you from, what he doesn't intend to spare you from, is to struggle against the flesh and against those temptations. No, that he doesn't intend to spare you from. He wants you to engage in that struggle every single day. That night, there should have been no substitute for those disciples in the garden from taking some time to think and remember and ponder the meaning of all the things Jesus had said to them, and to pray for the wisdom to understand it and the strength to live by it. And there's no substitute for you and I taking the time to do those same things too. So look at your life, look at your calendar, look at your schedule, and ask yourself the question, is taking time to remember the things that Jesus has told you in his word, and to pray for wisdom and to pray for strength as you go through your daily life, is that time a priority on your calendar and on your schedule? Only you can answer that question. But now is no time for you and I to take our hands off the wheel. Midnight was falling in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that night it was time to pray, and to pray urgently. And in our age and in our world, friends, I think we can safely say the same is true, because the hour is getting late. Darkness is falling all around us. Evil forces are on the prowl, looking to pick off and devour the spiritually weak and unready, and tragically sometimes we see them succeeding. Midnight is not far off. And just as it was long ago in the garden, someone is coming. Only this time it's not Judas and the band of Roman soldiers. It's the Lord of glory himself, coming to judge the world that he made. This is no time for spiritual slumber. Keep your eyes on Jesus, and be thankful that in his most crucial hour there in the garden, he never failed or faltered. Put your trust in his cross and ask him daily for the strength to endure the crosses that he gives you to bear. and he will never fail to hear you and answer you for his name's sake.